David Pearson stood motionless in front of the floor-length mirror in his bedroom, his weathered hands gripping the dark wooden frame. At 52, he cut an impressive figure. Salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his 6-foot frame still fit from years of construction work. But today, his usually confident posture was slumped, his blue eyes clouded with a storm of emotions he couldn't quite name. The reflection staring back at him felt foreign, like a stranger wearing his face. In the background, he could see the rumpled sheets of the king-size bed he'd shared with Sarah for the past 27 years. The same bed where, just hours ago, his world had come crashing down around him. "How could they?" he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the quiet of the empty room. The question hung in the air, unanswered and mocking. Sarah, his high school sweetheart, the woman he'd built his entire life around. And Emma, their 19-year-old daughter, the apple of his eye since the day she was born. The two people he loved most in this world had betrayed him in the cruelest way imaginable. David's mind raced back to the events of the morning. He'd come home early from a job site, hoping to surprise Sarah with lunch. Instead, he'd overheard a hushed phone conversation that turned his blood to ice. "Mom, you can't keep this up." Emma's voice had drifted from the kitchen. "Dad's going to find out eventually." "I know, sweetie," Sarah had replied, her tone a mix of guilt and defiance. "But I love Richard. Your father, he just doesn't understand me anymore." David had stood there, frozen in disbelief, as his wife and daughter continued their conversation, unaware of his presence. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The late nights at the office, the sudden interest in yoga classes, the hushed phone calls. Sarah had been having an affair, and Emma had been covering for her. Now, hours later, David still couldn't wrap his head around it. How long had this been going on? How many lies had been told? How many times had Emma looked him in the eye, knowing the truth but choosing to protect her mother instead? The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Anger bubbled up from deep within, mixed with a profound sense of betrayal and loss. The life he thought he knew, the family he'd sacrificed everything for, it had all been built on a foundation of lies. David's gaze hardened as he stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him wasn't the same person who had left for work this morning. That man had been trusting, perhaps naive. This new David felt something darker stirring inside him, something he'd never experienced before. "They think they can just throw away 27 years like it's nothing," he muttered, his hands clenching into fists. "Well, we'll see about that." As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, David made a decision. He wouldn't confront them. Not yet. No, he would bide his time, gather more information. And then he would make them pay for what they'd done. He straightened his shoulders, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sarah and Emma had no idea what was coming. They thought they'd pulled one over on good old dependable David. But they were about to learn that even the most patient man has his breaking point. With newfound purpose, David turned away from the mirror. He had plans to make, and not much time to do it. The game was about to change, and this time, he would be the one calling the shots. As he left the bedroom, the weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy cloak. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the Pearson household as dawn broke over the suburban landscape. David stood at the kitchen counter, mechanically going through the motions of his usual morning routine. The events of yesterday felt like a surreal nightmare, but the dull ache in his chest reminded him that it was all too real. He heard footsteps on the stairs and steeled himself. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her honey blonde hair slightly tousled from sleep. For a moment, David's breath caught in his throat. Even after all these years, her beauty still had the power to affect him. But now, that beauty was tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. "Morning, honey," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of forced cheerfulness. "You're up early." David plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a head start on the day." He watched as Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, noticing the slight tremor in her hands. Did she suspect that he knew? Or was it just the guilt eating away at her? "Any plans for today?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Sarah took a sip of her coffee before answering. "Oh, just the usual. Errands, maybe catch up on some work. Oh, and I have yoga class this evening." David's jaw clenched involuntarily. Yoga class. He wondered if that's where she met Richard, or if it was just another lie in a long string of deceptions. "Sounds good," he managed to say. "I might be home late tonight. Big project coming up at work." Sarah nodded, relief flickering across her face. "Of course, dear. Don't work too hard." The irony of her concern wasn't lost on David. He watched as she busied herself with making toast, her movements betraying a nervousness that she was trying hard to conceal. A few minutes later, Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her eyes still heavy with sleep. David felt a pang in his heart as he looked at his daughter. How had they gotten to this point? When had his little girl decided that lying to him was acceptable? "Morning, sweetie," David said, handing her a glass of orange juice. Emma mumbled a sleepy thanks, avoiding direct eye contact. Was it guilt, David wondered, or just typical teenage morning grumpiness? As the three of them sat around the kitchen table, an uncomfortable silence settled over them. David could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. He watched as Sarah and Emma exchanged quick glances, a silent communication passing between them that excluded him entirely. "So, Emma," David said, breaking the silence, "how's school going? Any interesting projects coming up?" Emma shifted in her seat. "It's fine, Dad. Just the usual stuff." David nodded, noting the way she deflected the question. "And how about that boy you were seeing? Mark, was it?" "Oh, we broke up," Emma said, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It wasn't really working out." Another lie, David thought bitterly. He knew for a fact that Emma was still seeing Mark. He'd overheard her talking to him on the phone just last week. As breakfast wound down, David stood up, grabbing his briefcase. "Well, I'm off. Have a good day, you two." He leaned down to kiss Sarah on the cheek, fighting back the revulsion that threatened to overtake him. She smiled up at him, but he could see the guilt swimming in her eyes. "Bye, Dad," Emma called out as he headed for the door. David paused, turning back to look at his wife and daughter one last time. They sat there, the picture of suburban normalcy. But he knew better now. Behind those smiles and casual goodbyes lay a web of lies and betrayal that threatened to tear their family apart. As he closed the front door behind him, David took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The mask of normalcy he'd worn throughout breakfast slipped away, replaced by a hardened resolve. He had played his part well, but the real work was just beginning. He climbed into his truck, his mind already racing with plans. Today he would start gathering evidence. Phone records, credit card statements, anything that could prove Sarah's infidelity. And as for Emma's role in all this, well, he had something special in mind for her. As David pulled out of the driveway, he caught a glimpse of Sarah watching him from the kitchen window. He raised his hand in a final wave, a gesture that once held love but now felt hollow. "Game on," he muttered to himself as he drove away, leaving behind the facade of his perfect family life. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but David was determined to see it through to the bitter end. The fluorescent lights of the copy shop hummed softly as David stood before the whirring machine, watching page after page emerge. Each sheet contained damning evidence. Phone records showing late-night calls to an unknown number, credit card statements with suspicious charges for hotels and expensive restaurants, and GPS data from Sarah's phone showing frequent visits to an unfamiliar address in a posh neighborhood across town. As he collected the warm papers, David felt a mixture of vindication and nausea. The proof was irrefutable, laid out in black and white before him. Yet, seeing it all compiled like this made the betrayal feel even more visceral. "That'll be $24.50, the board clerk behind the counter drawled. David handed over his credit card, careful to use the one Sarah didn't have access to. No need to leave a paper trail of his own investigations. Back in his truck, David flipped through the stack of papers. His eyes landed on a particular date, June 15th, their wedding anniversary. According to the phone records, Sarah had spent over an hour on the phone with her lover that night, while David had been working late to afford the necklace he'd surprised her with the next day. The memory of her feigned delight upon receiving the gift now turned his stomach. How long had she been playing him for a fool? David's phone buzzed, interrupting his brooding. A text from Emma flashed on the screen. "Hey, Dad, can I borrow the car tonight? Going to study group at Jen's." Another lie. David had already checked Emma's school schedule. There was no study group tonight. He typed out a reply, his fingers moving mechanically. "Sure, sweetie. Be safe." He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, disgust rising in his throat. Not only was Emma lying to cover for her mother, but she was now using those same tactics for her own deceptions. Like mother, like daughter, he thought bitterly. Starting the engine, David pulled out of the parking lot. His next stop was a small electronics store tucked away in a strip mall on the outskirts of town. The bell jingled as he pushed open the door, drawing the attention of a lanky young man with thick-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you, sir?" the clerk asked, eyeing David curiously. David cleared his throat. "I'm looking for some surveillance equipment for home security," he added quickly. The clerk's eyebrow raised slightly, but he nodded. "We've got a few options. What exactly did you have in mind?" 30 minutes later, David left the store with a small bag containing tiny cameras, audio recorders, and a GPS tracker. He felt a twinge of guilt at the thought of spying on his own family, but he quickly pushed it aside. They had betrayed his trust. He owed them nothing now. As he drove home, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the darkness swirling in David's mind. He had the tools now, both the evidence of Sarah's infidelity and the means to gather more. But what would he do with it all? The house was quiet when he arrived. Sarah's car was gone, off to yoga class, no doubt. Emma's bedroom door was closed, muffled music seeping out from beneath it. David moved silently through the rooms, strategically placing cameras and recorders in discreet locations. In the master bedroom, he paused, staring at the bed where he and Sarah had shared so many intimate moments. Now it felt tainted, a symbol of her betrayal. With trembling hands, he placed a tiny camera on the bookshelf, angled perfectly to capture the entire room. As he finished his covert operation, David heard the front door open. Sarah's voice called out, "I'm home!" Quickly, he shoved the remaining equipment into his toolbox and stepped out of the bedroom. "In here," he called back, forcing a neutral tone. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from exercise, or perhaps from something else entirely. "Hey, you're home early?" she said, a note of surprise in her voice. David shrugged. "Yeah, wrapped up at the site sooner than expected." He gestured to his toolbox. "Just fixing that loose floorboard." Sarah nodded, seemingly accepting his explanation. "That's great, honey. I'm going to grab a shower before dinner." As she turned to leave, David caught a whiff of unfamiliar cologne. It took every ounce of self-control not to confront her then and there. Instead, he muttered, "Sounds good," and busied himself with his toolbox. Later that night, as the house slept, David sat in his home office, bathed in the pale glow of his computer screen. He had connected the surveillance devices to his laptop and was now watching and listening to the quiet house. In one window, he could see Sarah sleeping peacefully in their bed. In another, Emma's room, where she was typing furiously on her phone, no doubt spinning more lies. David leaned back in his chair, the weight of his actions settling heavily upon him. He was standing on a precipice, teetering between the life he had known and the dark unknown that lay ahead. There was no going back now. As thunder rumbled in the distance, David began to formulate his plan. He would let this play out a little longer, gathering more evidence, building an ironclad case. And then, when the moment was right, he would confront them both. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows. David barely noticed, lost in his own tempest of betrayal, anger, and a growing desire for revenge. The Pearson household, once a haven of love and trust, had become a battleground, and David was prepared to fight with everything he had. Weeks passed, and David felt himself slipping further into a world of secrets and surveillance. The cameras and recorders he'd planted throughout the house fed him a constant stream of information, each new revelation twisting the knife of betrayal deeper into his heart. He watched as Sarah sneaked phone calls when she thought no one was listening, her voice low and intimate as she spoke to Richard. He listened as Emma coordinated alibis with her mother, their conspiracy laid bare in hushed conversations. David's days became a blur of work and obsessive monitoring. He'd rush home each evening, not to spend time with his family, but to pore over the day's recordings. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his colleagues at work began to whisper about his distracted demeanor. One particularly gloomy Tuesday evening, David sat in his darkened home office, headphones on, listening to yet another damning conversation between Sarah and Emma. "Mom, I don't know how much longer I can keep lying to Dad." Emma's voice crackled through the speakers. "It's eating me up inside," Sarah sighed. "I know, sweetie. I don't like it either, but I'm not ready to hurt your father like that. I just need a little more time to figure things out with Richard." David's hands clenched into fists. Figure things out? What was there to figure out? She was having an affair, plain and simple. A soft knock at the office door made David jump. He quickly closed the surveillance program and pulled off his headphones. "Come in," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma poked her head in, her long brown hair falling around her face. Hey, Dad, I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. For a moment, hope flared in David's chest. Was she finally going to come clean? Sure, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Emma stepped into the room, fidgeting nervously with the hem of her shirt. Well, I was wondering if I could borrow some money. There's this concert next weekend and all my friends are going. The hope in David's chest turned to ash. Just another lie, another manipulation. He stared at his daughter, seeing her in a new light. Gone was the innocent little girl he'd raised. In her place stood a young woman capable of deception and betrayal. How much? He asked, his voice flat. Emma blinked, thrown off by his tone. $200? I promise I'll pay you back for my summer job. David reached for his wallet, pulling out the requested amount. As he handed over the bills, he looked Emma directly in the eyes. Is there anything else you want to tell me, Emma? Anything at all? For a moment, Emma froze, her eyes widening slightly. Then she shook her head, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. No, that's all. Thanks, Dad. You're the best. As she turned to leave, David called out, Emma? She paused at the door, looking back at him. I love you, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Emma's smile softened, becoming genuine for a moment. I love you too, Dad. As the door closed behind her, David slumped in his chair. The gulf between them had never felt so wide. Later that night, as David lay awake in bed, Sarah's soft breathing beside him, he made a decision. He couldn't go on like this anymore. The constant surveillance, the lies, the betrayal. It was all becoming too much to bear. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would confront them both. With that resolution made, David finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, his dreams plagued by images of crumbling families and shattered trust. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in David's mind. He went through his morning routine mechanically, barely tasting his coffee, hardly hearing Sarah's cheerful chatter about her plans for the day. As Sarah prepared to leave for work, David caught her arm. We need to talk tonight, he said, his voice low and serious. All of us, you, me, and Emma. Sarah's smile faltered, a flicker of fear passing through her eyes. Is everything okay? David met her gaze steadily. No, he said simply. It's not, but it will be after tonight. As Sarah's car pulled out of the driveway, David felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The die was cast. By this time tomorrow, everything would be out in the open. He spent the day at work in a haze, his mind rehearsing what he would say, how he would present the evidence he'd gathered. As the sun began to set, he drove home, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. The house was quiet when he arrived. Sarah's car was in the driveway, and he could hear movement in the kitchen. Taking a deep breath, David stepped inside, ready to face the moment he'd been building towards for weeks. Sarah, Emma, he called out. Can you both come to the living room? We need to talk. As he heard footsteps approaching, David squared his shoulders. The time for secrets and lies was over. Now, finally, the truth would come out, and with it, the consequences that had been long in coming. The tension in the living room was palpable as Sarah and Emma settled onto the couch, exchanging nervous glances. David stood before them, his back straight, hands clasped behind him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, adding to the somber atmosphere. Dad, what's going on? Emma asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. I know everything, he said, his voice low and controlled. About the affair, about the lies, about how you've both been deceiving me for months. Sarah's face drained of color, while Emma's eyes widened in shock. David, Sarah began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. No more lies, Sarah. I have proof. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive. Phone records, credit card statements, GPS data, it's all here. Emma leapt to her feet. You've been spying on us? She exclaimed, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. David turned his gaze to his daughter, his eyes hard. And you've been lying to me, Emma. Covering for your mother, creating alibis. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. Mom said, Don't blame this on me, Sarah interjected, standing up as well. Emma, I never asked you to lie for me. Didn't you? David's voice was cold. Maybe not in so many words, but you put her in an impossible position. Our daughter, Sarah. How could you? The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the revelations hanging heavy in the air. Sarah sank back onto the couch, her head in her hands. Emma stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. David moved to the center of the room, addressing them both. I want you to understand something. This isn't just about the affair, Sarah. It's about the breach of trust from both of you. He turned to Emma. I expected better from you, Emma. I thought we raised you with stronger values than this. Emma's sobs intensified. I'm so sorry, Dad. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. I didn't want to hurt you. And yet, here we are, David replied, his voice softening slightly. He turned back to Sarah. Who is he? Sarah looked up, her makeup smeared by tears. His name is Richard. He's a client at the firm. David, I never meant for this to happen. I was feeling neglected, and he was there, and neglected? David's voice rose. I've worked 60-hour weeks for years to give this family everything. I've sacrificed my time, my health, everything for you and Emma. And this is how you repay me? The room fell silent again, broken only by the sound of muffled sobs. David paced the room, running his hands through his hair. The anger that had been building for weeks was threatening to boil over, but he forced himself to remain in control. Here's what's going to happen, he said finally, his voice steady. Sarah, you're going to end it with Richard immediately. If you choose not to, I'll be contacting a divorce lawyer first thing in the morning. Sarah nodded mutely, unable to meet his eyes. David turned to Emma. And you, young lady, you're grounded indefinitely. No phone, no computer except for schoolwork, and no going out except for school and family activities. You've lost my trust, and it's going to take a long time to earn it back. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. I understand, Dad. I'm so sorry. David looked between the two of them, feeling a complex mix of emotions: anger, sadness, disappointment, and a deep, aching loss. I love you both, he said, his voice cracking slightly. But right now, I don't like either of you very much. It's going to take time for me to process this, to decide if I can move past it. He moved towards the door, pausing to look back at them one last time. I'm going out. I need some air. When I come back, we'll discuss how we move forward from here, if we can move forward at all. With that, David walked out of the house, leaving Sarah and Emma in stunned silence. As he climbed into his truck, he felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The truth was out, the confrontation over. But the future of his family hung in the balance, and he had no idea what tomorrow would bring. As he drove into the gathering darkness, David realized that this was just the beginning. The real work of healing, of rebuilding trust, of deciding whether their family could survive this betrayal was yet to come. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, David wondered if the love he once felt for Sarah and Emma could ever be fully restored. The days following the confrontation passed in a haze of tense silences and awkward interactions. David found himself sleeping in the guest room, unable to bear lying next to Sarah in their marital bed. Emma kept to her room, only emerging for meals, her eyes red-rimmed and downcast. A week after the revelation, David sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a deceptively cheerful light on the somber scene. He heard soft footsteps and looked up to see Sarah hesitantly entering the room. David, she said softly, can we talk? He gestured to the chair across from him, his face impassive. Sarah sat down, her hands fidgeting nervously on the table. I ended it with Richard, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. For good. I want to try to make this work, if you'll let me. David studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he sighed heavily. I don't know if I can, Sarah. The trust is gone. How can I ever be sure you're not lying to me again? Sarah's eyes welled with tears. I know I've hurt you terribly, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But we've built 27 years together, David. Doesn't that count for something? Before David could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Can I join you? She asked timidly. David nodded, and Emma took a seat at the table, completing their fractured family circle. I've been doing a lot of thinking, David said, looking between his wife and daughter, about how we got here and where we go from here. He turned to Sarah. You said you felt neglected. I can acknowledge that I've been distant, focused on work, but that doesn't justify what you did. Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. I know, it was selfish and stupid, and I'm so sorry. David then addressed Emma. And you, Emma, I understand you were in a difficult position, but lying to me, covering up your mother's affair, that's not the daughter we raised you to be. Emma's lower lip trembled. I know, Dad. I was weak and I made the wrong choice. I want to make it right. David leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of their collective pain and regret. I've decided, he said slowly, that I'm willing to try, to work on our marriage, to rebuild our family. But it's going to take time and a lot of effort from all of us. Sarah reached out, tentatively placing her hand on David's. He didn't pull away, but he didn't reciprocate either. What do you need from us? She asked. Transparency, David replied firmly. Complete and total honesty from both of you. No more secrets, no more lies, and we're going to start seeing a family therapist. Emma and Sarah both nodded eagerly, relief evident on their faces. And Emma, David continued, you're still grounded, but I'm willing to reduce the duration if you show real effort in rebuilding trust. That means being honest about your whereabouts, your friends, and your activities. I will, Dad, I promise, Emma said earnestly. David stood up, his chair scraping against the tile floor. This isn't going to be easy. There will be days when I'm angry, when I don't know if I can get past this, but I'm willing to try for the sake of our family. Our. As he moved to leave the kitchen, Sarah called out, David? He paused, looking back at her. Thank you, she said softly, for giving us another chance. David nodded once, his expression softening slightly. We've got a long road ahead of us, he said. But maybe, just maybe, we can find our way back. As he walked out of the kitchen, David felt a glimmer of hope amidst the pain and betrayal. The future was uncertain, the wounds still raw, but there was a chance, however small, that their family could heal. That evening, as the sun set on another tense day in the Pearson household, David sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to deep purple. The sound of the back door opening made him turn. Emma stood there, a tentative smile on her face. Mind if I join you, Dad? David patted the seat next to him, and Emma sat down. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky. Dad, Emma said finally, her voice soft, I know it doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know how sorry I am and how much I love you. David turned to look at his daughter, seeing not the young woman who had lied to him, but the little girl who used to climb into his lap for bedtime stories. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I love you too, Emma, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to get through this, as a family. As they sat there, father and daughter, reunited under the vast canopy of stars, David felt the first real stirring of forgiveness in his heart. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but in that moment, he knew that love, however battered and bruised, could still triumph over betrayal. 6 months had passed since the night of revelations that had shaken the Pearson family to its core. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as David stood in the driveway, watching Emma load the last of her boxes into her car. Are you sure you have everything? He asked, a hint of worry in his voice. Emma smiled, closing the trunk. Yes, Dad, and if I forgot anything, it's only a 2-hour drive back home. Home? The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. So much had changed in the past half year, yet somehow they had managed to keep their family intact. The weekly therapy sessions had been grueling at first, dredging up old wounds and resentments. But slowly, painfully, they had begun to heal. Sarah had thrown herself into rebuilding their marriage, showing a dedication that both surprised and touched David. Emma had worked tirelessly to regain her parents' trust, her efforts a constant reminder of the strong, principled young woman they had raised. David pulled Emma into a tight hug. I'm proud of you, kiddo, not just for getting into your dream college, but for how you've handled everything these past few months. Emma hugged him back fiercely. Thanks, Dad, for everything, for giving us another chance. As they separated, Sarah emerged from the house, carrying a bag of snacks for Emma's drive. Don't forget to eat something healthy, too, she admonished gently, handing over the bag. Emma rolled her eyes good-naturedly. Yes, Mom. I promise I won't survive on chips and energy drinks. The three of them stood there for a moment, an island of calm in the sea of change that surrounded them. David felt a lump form in his throat as he realized this was it. Their daughter was really leaving for college. You'll call when you get there? Sarah asked, her voice wavering slightly. Emma nodded. Of course. I'll call every week. I promise. One last round of hugs, and then Emma was in her car, waving as she backed out of the driveway. David and Sarah stood arm in arm, watching until her car disappeared around the corner. As they turned to go back inside, David caught Sarah's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We did good, didn't we? She asked softly. David nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. We did. It wasn't easy, but we did. They walked back into the house, the silence of Emma's absence already palpable. As Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, David found himself drawn to their bedroom. He stood in the doorway, his eyes landing on the dresser where, months ago, he had hidden a tiny camera. With purposeful strides, he crossed the room and opened the drawer. The camera was still there, a silent reminder of darker days. David picked it up, turning it over in his hands. David, Sarah's voice called from downstairs. What would you like for dinner? He looked at the camera one last time before dropping it into the wastebasket. Whatever you feel like making, he called back. I trust you. As he descended the stairs, David felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Trust, once shattered, was slowly being rebuilt. Love, tested by fire, had emerged stronger. That evening, as David and Sarah sat on the back porch, watching the sunset on this new chapter of their lives, he realized something profound. The man who had stood before that mirror 6 months ago, consumed by anger and thoughts of revenge, was gone. In his place was someone older, perhaps, and certainly wiser. Someone who had learned the hard way that love, forgiveness, and trust were choices that had to be made every single day. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, and David wrapped an arm around her. What are you thinking about? She asked. David smiled, planting a soft kiss on the top of her head. I'm thinking that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. As the stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, David Pearson looked to the future with hope. The road had been long and arduous, but they had weathered the storm together. And in the end, that's what family was all about.